there. I hope it's not upsetting. Here we go.
I'm not hearing anything, Les.
Yeah, that's very soothing music, Liz.
Oh, sorry, maybe it's just me.
No, it's not. I was being ironic.
Is it just
Okay.
Robin?
Leslie, I
I
think
can't
if you,
hear
No, we're
anything
not
either.
hearing it.
Leslie, I'm not
Okay.
sure that you can stream your audio, whether it's
Yeah.
YouTube or another audio channel through the Zoom, besides
Oh,
what,
I
what
have
your mic
always done
actually
it
is.
before.
Oh,
It might
okay.
just be your audio that needs to be ticked at the bottom there. When
Okay,
you
well, can I
share
tell you, it's a very nice song and I'm enjoying it immensely. So can you stop talking?
Hey, how's it? How's it?
Hi, Rabs.
Hi. I'm presuming a load shedding, so it's like I might disappear every moment. So here I am.
Yeah.
Same applies to us. We're supposed to be low shed at 6, so we're praying.
Exactly. So it's like it is what it is.
Us too.
We had
Exactly.
10 to 12:30, so we're hoping.
Don't.
There's no music. I can't believe it. I chose such nice music.
There.
You got it. Hey, Wayne.
Heard some bars. Yes.
Don't legislate, my love. You're not walking in my shoes. Don't hide behind your religion. It's my right to marry whom I choose. It's not your place to call me a sinner.
You know what bird that is? Because
To have as my mate. Don't twist the words of the Bible to make laws that discriminate. Hey, Mr. Politician, there's no debate. We already separated church and state. Your religion should never abuse or take away my freedom to choose. Hey, Mr. Politician, don't legislate my body. You're not walking in my shoes. Don't hide behind self-righteousness. It's my right not to give birth if I choose. It's not your place to turn back the clock to a time when I had no voice. Don't try to take away my right to have freedom of choice. Hey, Mr. Politician, there's no debate. We already separated church and state. Your religion should never abuse or take away my freedom to choose. Hey, Mr. Politician, don't legislate my death. You're not walking in my shoes. Don't hide behind your anxious fear. It's my right to die when I choose. It's not your place to decide how much pain I should have to endure. I alone will choose my time to go. My disease has no cure. Hey, Mr. Politician, there's no debate. We already separated church and state. Your religion should never abuse or take away my freedom to choose. Hey, Mr. Politician, don't send me to war. You're not walking in my shoes. Don't hide behind the battle. It's not worth the lives we lose. It's not your place to lead your crusade, teaching our children to fight. Oh, say, can you see the price we paid in death by the dawn's early light? Hey, Mr. Politician, there's no debate. We already...
Okay, welcome everybody. It's lovely to have you here, and it's very exciting to have another one of our Zoom clubs. It reminds us that we're still living under strange conditions, but within those conditions, we still continue. Tonight we have an election special, and as I was saying in Shul last Friday night, local government is particularly important to us because it's the space in which we experience our lives the closest. It's the space in which we live, play, work, worship, educate, receive basic health care, and those are the things that really impact on our lives. And so these local government elections are particularly important because of that. The other thing that I was saying is that while most of us can agree on what the challenges are, I don't think anyone would put up their hand and say, I'm for corruption, I'm for no electricity, I'm for no water. Where we differ is what the solutions to those challenges are. So tonight we have three spectacular guests. I'm going to say in no particular order because we are tap dancing a little bit here. But the first guest is Paul Berkowitz. Apparently he came very close to being a member of our congregation and then did a turn. And Paul is a specialist in elections.
He defected.
Okay, I never said that. Please note the face on the screen. Okay, so Paul is a specialist in elections and has a deep fascination with numbers. And then we have our own Wayne Sussman, who preferred to be known as the husband of Lee Noodleman. And somehow thinks that that gives him credibility to talk on the elections, and somehow has managed to persuade the Daily Maverick and ENCA that he should be their expert on elections as well. I'm not sure how that worked, Wayne, but perhaps you can tell us. And then we have Ibrahim Fakir, who is a well-known commentator on electoral practices and is the anchor for the SABC on elections. And in fact, the reason you don't see his face on the screen now is that he's popped out to do his bit on the SABC. So we're very grateful to have these three people with us. All of them are incredibly busy, and all of them have given us the exclusive of spending some time with us. So the way it's going to work is I'm going to allow each of them an opportunity to present. They're looking at different aspects of local government and the elections, and then I'll open it up for questions or comments. So if you have any, just note them down in your book, and we'll come to them at the end. So Paul, can we put you on first? He will be speaking about the polls and trends and what possibly they are telling us. I've been told that he may say things that are diametrically opposed to what Wayne's going to say. And so we're couching all of this in the terms of scenarios, not predictions. Am I right, Paul?
That's correct, Leslie.
Okay, so there you go, Paul, over to you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Leslie. Thanks for the introduction. Good evening, everyone. So nice that you have accepted me as a floor crosser to the Orthodox community. To address you in the Zoom. Hello to Wayne. Ibrahim will join us soon. Yeah, so I'm going to go through one or two scenarios for the 5 biggest metros. I don't know, there's space now for opening remarks, but I'm sure we'll discuss all of the details and diversions of why this election is particularly chaotic, hard to predict, has a lot of moving parts, and there are few polls. I think let's start there. We talked about polls and predictions, but there are very few credible polls. And the ones we've seen in the last week or two, including the Victory Research one, and which has been done in-house for News 24, hasn't been interpreted very well by the journalists. because of the lack of technical knowledge about population dynamics and population statistics. So short version of the story, we don't have a lot of polls. The scenarios that I'll be looking at are based on the hard evidence we do have, and there's not much of it. We've got the local government results from 2016, 5 years ago. We've got the 2019 national provincial elections, and we've got all the by-elections that we've had over the last 5 years, although those have dried up quite a lot because of lockdown. And if you want a more detailed exposition about the by-elections, I do advise you to head over to the Daily Maverick, where Wayne has covered everything in a lot of detail, in a lot of depth. I am putting the link to the presentation that I will be putting up and sharing on screen with you in the chat. So if you'd like to open it on your own computer, it's a nice little series of interactive charts to show what might happen after the election dust has settled and what the municipal councils will look like or might look like. It does not talk about which parties will form coalitions. I think Wayne will look at that. And yeah, the caveat that Leslie spoke about, Wayne, if my numbers are very far from yours, please feel free to chuck them out. Okay. So here's the presentation, and we've dubbed it a little cheekily, the 2021 local government edition of What If. And if you don't get the reference and the logo, ask a young person. What If is a Marvel Comics imprint and now a TV series under Marvel Disney that talks about alternate realities where your favorite superheroes end up doing things that they wouldn't normally do in the mainstream Marvel universe. Not to say that our politicians and parties are superheroes, but yeah, I hope you can see the common link. All right, I'm going to start with Johannesburg. And just to, if you want to navigate this on your side and play with it in your own time, it's a normal slideshow, but it's very pretty. It's made in Flourish. You can click through the slides on the top left. Each of these 5 slides shows a different metro and a possible council seat allocation. Again, in the top left, we start out with the status quo ante, what happened in 2016. I've also thrown in a little wrinkle for Johannesburg, particularly to show you what the current situation looks like, because there have been quite a few by-election wins and losses. And these graphs are lovely and interactive. You can hover over any of the parties. It will highlight the number of seats that the party won and the party's abbreviation. So in 2016, the DA won 104 seats in the city of Johannesburg. The ANC won 121. And as you can see, there was no party with the majority. The ANC was fairly close, but wasn't able to form a coalition. The DA and the EFF loosely formed a coalition with some help from the IFP and 1 or 2 of the smaller parties. Now, if there are any inherent biases in the work that I've put in, I've tried to stick to what we know about the trends from by-elections, namely that the DA hasn't had a great time of it in the last 2 years. The EFF is looking particularly good over the long term. There's still scope for it to grow more, and its supporters are particularly loyal. We've seen that in the by-elections where even in the face of low turnout in certain wards, the EFF supporters have still come out, and the party has managed to grow against the backdrop of lower turnout. And I think that'll be very important if we discuss the possibility of a generally low turnout and how that will affect the parties. This was the 2016 picture. Since then, the DA has lost 7 ward seats, and those have been picked up, 3 by the ANC, 3 by the Patriotic Alliance, and 1 by Al Jama. As things stand, this is not going to be the picture after Monday. The ANC wouldn't need the EFF to form a majority coalition. It could easily get into bed with some of these smaller parties. Here is a scenario for 2021, with both the DA and the ANC losing further ground, still being relatively the largest parties, the ANC having a slight plurality, the EFF being the biggest beneficiary of growth, and Action SA doing particularly well. The party's campaigning in 6 wards, and it's widely expected to do the best in Johannesburg. In percentage terms, in this scenario, both the EFF and Action SA have got about 15%. And it becomes harder to form a coalition. These predictions, one more thing, they're a little flat. I haven't modeled what might happen with the new parties or the small parties. I've concentrated on the 4 or 5 biggest parties, being the ANC, DA, EFF, Action SA, and in some scenarios, the IFP and the Freedom Front Plus. Let's move on. This is the picture in Tshwane in 2016, where the DA had a slight advantage over the ANC, but still no majority. And the DA formed a coalition which came under a lot of pressure. There was some interference at the provincial level. Our prediction for 2021, or our scenario, I should stop saying prediction, is that the DA is under a lot of pressure and there's a lot of downside risk for the party in Tshwane. It's possible that the DA will lose quite heavily, partly to the Freedom Front Plus, partly to Action SA. And we may have a scenario where the DA, there's not much separating the DA from the EFF. And I think that may have implications, Wayne may or may not speak about this, about what happens to the parties like the DA and the ANC if they don't seize the initiative and they leave it to what were previously second string parties like the EFF and Action SA, and how that might affect them over the longer term. Nelson Mandela Bay was the municipality which saw the most commotion. I think there was some, Wayne will correct me if I'm wrong, I think there were 4 different coalitions and different councils, starting with the DA and then an ANC and another ANC and now a DA. This is the picture in 2016, no party getting an advantage. And in 2021, we predict that the DA and the ANC will lose a little bit of ground, and the EFF will gain slightly, and we'll have a similar pressure and possibly similar dynamics to what we've had over the last 5 years, where the DA and the ANC will be under pressure to form a stable, credible coalition, and there's always the threat of these small parties that play kingmaker, possibly swapping sides or extracting all sorts of advantages from the senior coalition partners. Ekurhuleni was possibly, of the 4 we've seen so far, strongest for the ANC. The party had a very close to a majority, was short by about 4 or 5 seats, and went into coalition with the AIC and with, let's find it, the Patriotic Alliance. One scenario for 2021 is the ANC losing slightly, the DA losing slightly more, the EFF growing fairly strongly, and Action SA and Freedom Front Plus making up some of the rest of the numbers. Broadly a similar dynamic to Joburg and Tshwane, in that depending on how you define opposition and who you think is most likely to form a coalition, and whether it's a bit of bias and wish fulfillment that we'll be maybe primarily looking for coalitions that exclude the ANC, it's these same parties, EFF, Action SA, Freedom Front Plus, and DA, that have the job of finding each other or not. And lastly, eThekwini, we've thrown this in. There is a chance. We've spoken to some of the DA members on the ground that have been campaigning in the metro and the municipal and the province. Although the ANC did have a majority in 2016, there's a good chance the party could lose the majority. The ANC has hopelessly mismanaged eThekwini. In 2016, when the previous mayor, Zandile Gumede, took over, irregular expenditure was around about 200 million. And 3 years later, by the time she'd been forced out by her own party, that figure had ballooned to 2.3 billion. So an 11-fold increase in the amount of corruption and skullduggery and bad things going on. So what we are looking at from a relatively healthy majority in 2016 is the possibility that the ANC will fall just under 50%, somewhere between 45 and 50, with the DA mostly treading water and some growth from the IFP, Action SA, and EFF. In these kind of scenarios, similar to Ekurhuleni in 2016, the most likely outcome supported by history and supported by political theory and strategic theory, is that if the ANC can form a stable enough coalition with small parties, the likes of the minorities of South Africa, the AIC, and so on and so forth, that will be the path that will be most likely for the party to go down. Okay, that's a whistle-stop tour, Wayne. I hope I haven't set you back too much. And I think that's a nice way to open up the possible discussion. I invite everyone to play around and to look at the charts themselves. I think it's a very engaging and entertaining way to deal with what can be quite dry and boring. And there are no side effects apart from I've developed a craving for Smarties, but I'm sure that will go after the elections.
Thank you very much, Paul. I'm going to use my prerogative as the facilitator here to ask a question and then ask everyone else to keep their questions to afterwards. Paul, as everybody knows, in local government elections, we have PR councillors and ward councillors. So do your scenarios, is that an aggregate of PR and ward councillors? I mean, do you just simply add together to get a majority, a total?
Yes. That's an aggregate view. If you wanted to go into more detail, Leslie, almost every single ward seat historically has been won by either the DA or the ANC. Our electoral system is broadly a PR system. And yeah, it's an overall view. Sharp-eyed people might have seen, Wayne can correct me if I'm wrong, the number of seats hasn't been increased in most of the municipalities, although it looks like eThekwini has gained an additional ward and PR seat compared to 2016. So the number of seats there has gone up from 219 to 221.
Okay, that's very useful. Thank you. Okay, well then we'll hold over until a little later on. Paul, thank you very much. I love the Smarties. And I must say, as I look up from my screen, all I see is dots on the wall. Too. So that's another side effect you might want to add. Wayne, it's over to you. And in fact, Wayne, I think that Paul has set your conversation up very nicely because he's talked about the trends and possible scenarios. And now Wayne is going to talk to us about coalitions. So bearing in mind the kind of smarty pictures that Paul's painted for us, we can hand over to Wayne to talk about coalitions more broadly in the local government elections. Thank you, Wayne. I will.
Right. It's an honor to present at the Bazoom Club again. I think the last time was the American elections. And it's really an honor to appear with Ibrahim and Paul and to be hosted by you, Leslie. And I also just want to thank Tembelani Mazibuko from the Electoral Institute of South Africa and Corinne Duplessis, the A-rated journalist, for joining this evening. So, and also apologies to people like Erwin Manoim who heard some of my shtick at Limud when I gave this presentation. I'm going to be repeating some of those slides, but I think some things over the last few days have certainly changed. So just a reminder, and I'm sure you can see the picture in front of me. It's a very famous picture. I think it's probably the most important picture of the 2016 local government elections. And here, Julius Malema, flanked by Godrich Gardy on the left and Floyd Shivambu on the right, with Alex Township as their backdrop, declaring that they are not going to work with the ANC. They are going to work with the opposition where they can. And this was absolutely significant. This is the main reason why the ANC lost many of the metros in 2016. Yes, the DA did well. Yes, the ANC lost a lot of ground. But if the EFF didn't decide to work with the DA in Tshwane and help the DA from the outside in places like the city of Johannesburg and municipalities in the Free State and Limpopo, we wouldn't have seen the change and the seismic shift in our politics because of what came from this photo. So this photo, I always go back to explain about coalitions in 2016. And just while we have it, often what happened with the EFF was they weren't actually in coalition with the DA. They supported them from the outside. So in a way, and Ibrahim can split hairs with me, but I would say that many of these governments were minority governments because the EFF did not take up mayoral committee member positions. They didn't take up speaker positions. They didn't demand, for instance, in a place like Rustenburg, where they're by far the second biggest party in a municipality where the ANC came under 50%, the mayoral position. They decided to sit on the outside and support those opposition parties in power where they could. So, change my slide. I'm just trying to change the slide. Oh, there. Okay, so 5 years later, 5 years and a few months later, things have certainly changed. Jacob Zuma is no longer leading the ANC. He was someone who was deeply unpopular, and I think someone who made it easier for Mmusi Maimane and James Self from the DA to do deals with the EFF. So I think that the EFF, although they were unpopular in many traditional DA circles, one of the things we have to understand from 2016 is that Jacob Zuma was actually more unpopular amongst the DA chattering classes than Julius Malema and the EFF. And 5 years later, I think that's certainly not the case. And that's why we live in very, very interesting times. And I would say right now, on the eve of the elections, let's start off with Cyril Ramaphosa. Yeah, I do not think he wants to work with the DA, and I do not think he wants to work with the EFF. And maybe some in his party would prefer to work with the EFF. Maybe some in his inner circle would prefer to work with the DA. But I definitely think there's a desire to not work with either. John Steenhuisen has made it categorically clear that he doesn't want to work with the EFF, despite the fact that there is an opinion that the only way to beat the ANC is to weaken them and to remove them from power. And on the eve of this election, I think we are in unprecedented times where we're going to see the greatest number of coalition where parties are going to be forced to seek coalition governments after this particular election. And then, of course, there's Julius Malema. I mean, why would he want to work with the DA? They keep on insulting him every single day on the election campaign. And does he want to work with Cyril Ramaphosa? Does that achieve his goal of one day becoming president by propping up the ANC? So the objectives are certainly uncommon, and we are in for an interesting few days. So recently, the Good Party, which I see they spelled Steenhuisen's name wrong, and I know Ibrahim commented on this meme, I think you call it as well. The Good Party, which aren't going to do so well in Johannesburg, but they're hoping to do well in the Western Cape, put out this meme, which says, I think you called it a meme, I don't know, or a flyer. The DA is willing to work with the ANC, and there they are lying in bed together, waking up the next morning. So I think it's very important at this stage, with 4 sleeps, excuse the pun, to go before the election, to just lay it out what is happening right now. So in municipalities and in national government across the country right now, the ANC is currently working with the following parties. Al-Jama'ah, which is a Muslim party, which won a seat off the DA in Johannesburg, in Lenasia, and they are hoping to do well in places like Cape Town as well, and possibly parts of Durban. So they have said, so what I'm saying is not what people have said on the campaign trail, but what is in place right now. We also know that the ANC right now are working with the IFP. The IFP was actually working with the DA and the EFF after the last elections. But when Herman Mashaba fell, when Herman Mashaba resigned, they moved over to the ANC. So the ANC are currently working with the IFP. They are currently working with Al-Jama'ah. They're also working with an obscure party, which I think is going to do very badly on Wednesday, but did quite well on Wednesday. In 2016, the African Independent Congress Party, whose basically their single issue is to reincorporate Matatiele from the Eastern Cape into KwaZulu-Natal. They ended up getting 4 seats, which is quite a number. I think they came 4th or 5th in Ekurhuleni, and they helped the ANC get over the line in quite a few municipalities. So we've said Al Jamaa, we've said the IFP, we have said the African Independent Congress. And the party which came up with this pamphlet, Good, are actually currently working with the ANC. Patricia de Lille sits in the national administration, in the national government, so I find it quite rich that they put out a poster about the DA being in bed with the ANC when they're actually literally in bed with the ANC right now. Then we turn to the DA. They go into this coalition with a strong working relationship with the Freedom Front and the African Christian Democratic Party. And then you have Congress of the People, COPE, Monsieur Laporta's party, which is going to do very badly on Monday. They are more in bed with the DA, but in some places in bed with the ANC. So that is where we are right now, where we have examples of coalitions. Now let's deal with what people have said on the campaign trail. Herman Mashaba from Action SA has said categorically he will not do a deal with the ANC. The Freedom Front have said categorically that they will work with the DA. And the DA have said that they will not work with the EFF. And then Al Jamaa have said that they will continue working with the ANC. We do not know right now what is going to happen with the IFP, whether they'll continue working with the ANC or whether they'll decide to look elsewhere. So I came up with this hierarchy of election outcomes of what the three major parties will want on election night. And of course, the ANC wants an outright win. They want, and when I gave this presentation at Limud, the ANC was actually in a better position then. I think they're in a weaker position right now. It doesn't look likely that they are going to win outright, as Paul just said far more eloquently with these beautiful slides and smarties. In Johannesburg, in Ekurhuleni, in the East Rand, in Tshwane, and in Nelson Mandela Bay. And there's a horrific scenario for the ANC that they lose outright control of Mangaung, which is Bloemfontein, and eThekwini, which is Durban. So then we go to scenario 2, the second best scenario in this hierarchy of election outcomes. And that is to find parties to do deals with who are not going to hold them to ransom and not going to cause them embarrassment. So these are parties like Al Jamaa, who I've spoken about previously. I would say parties like the Inkatha Freedom Party is another party the ANC would like to continue doing business with. Good is a party the ANC would certainly like to do business with, because these parties are pretty pragmatic and are not going to be unreasonable when it comes to coalition negotiations and are not going to destroy the coalition because of the whim and fancy of some councillor like we saw in Nelson Mandela Bay. The third one is a less comfortable one for the ANC, and that is possibly one which might actually take place in eThekwini. So what's interesting in eThekwini in Durban is that Jacob Zuma, there are a lot of political parties which are linked to him which aren't the ANC. So you might have heard of the African Transformation Movement. There's an obscure party called the African Freedom Movement, which is led by Jacob Zuma's pastor. There's a party called the Abantu Boto Convention, which I think is going to do pretty okay in parts of KwaZulu-Natal, which are linked to a former backer of Jacob Zuma. So the ANC might have to turn to these parties. I call them the RET parties. Another party which I label in this bunch is Gayton McKenzie. Maybe it's unfair to the RET movement. I consider him part of the RET party, part of the RET faction, as in these are the guys which Cyril Ramaphosa actually doesn't want to do deals with. As I said earlier, in Nelson Mandela Bay, there was a councillor called Marlon Daniels. He was a one-man wrecking ball. He decided at his whim and fancies from the Patriotic Alliance when to sink or prop up a coalition. And I would say the ANC, that's a third case scenario. They don't really want to work with too many of these RET parties. And the fourth scenario is to rather choose opposition over dysfunction, that they'd rather sit in opposition than being held to ransom by some of these difficult parties and do further harm to the ANC brand. Let's now move to the Democratic Alliance. They want outright wins in Cape Town, Midvaal and Kocha, and a variety of municipalities in the Western Cape, like the Drakensberg municipality, which is Paarl and Wellington, the second largest municipality. Number 2 is to bring the ANC under 50% in all metros, bar Buffalo City, and finish no lower than second in all the metros. So this, by the way, in the city of Johannesburg, if things go exceedingly well for Action SA, and the DA's tailspin continues, but I think that's been arrested somewhat with all the power outages. I think that the spotlight is slightly off them than it was a few days ago. But there is a scenario in Johannesburg where the DA actually finishes third. But this is their second scenario. And why is this scenario important? Because on the one hand, it's showing that the ANC is on a continued decline and that they're vulnerable. And the DA, by finishing second, is hoping to say, look, even though we are slightly weaker, even though our leader isn't as handsome as our previous leader, we are still the next best alternative. Their third scenario, and I would actually add Tshwane here now, that they form a coalition with natural coalition partners. Again, those are parties like the United Democratic Movement, the Freedom Front, the ACDP, possibly some interesting local parties like the Abantu Integrity Movement in Nelson Mandela Bay. So forming stable coalitions, just like the ANC was. And fourthly is, and this is clear what the DA is saying, we rather go into opposition than being forced to work with the EFF. Let me finish now with the EFF. And again, this is to bring, firstly, the ANC under 50% in all metros. I don't think this will be possible in Buffalo City and East London. This, by the way, Buffalo City, in my opinion, will be the most secure metro in South Africa. Right now, that's the city of Cape Town. What I mean by secure, where a party is the most dominant. So that's their first scenario. And they want to continue as kingmakers, like they did in Tshwane. They'd like to be able to do that in Johannesburg. And I think this second point is more apparent in 2021 than it was in 2016. That in many metros and in key municipalities across the country, the EFF is likely to be the kingmaker after this election. They want to become the second party in many metros. I think there's a scenario, by the way, that they might finish fourth even in the city of Johannesburg. That'll be a major setback. Right now, I don't see them finishing second in any metro. And earlier I spoke about the EFF not entering any coalition formally, i.e. asking for positions. I think this has a reason that Julius Malema is pretty autocratic in the way he runs the party. I think the EFF will have no choice for their continued trajectory, for their continued aspirations, to identify that even though it's like a pretty top-down party, that after this election, it will not be a bad thing to have EFF mayors in certain municipalities across the country. So to confirm, I think it's going to be hell of a unstable. I think we are likely to not have workable coalitions in many parts of the country. And the conclusion here is that many people who over the last 5 years have lived under a coalition have not enjoyed the best of experiences. And the irony is that when we wake up on Tuesday morning, there are going to be far more South Africans waking up with the reality that their municipality is no longer controlled by one party, but is going to be controlled by coalitions. Thank you. Hello, thank you.
Thank you. Where's Leslie?
Sorry, thank you, Wayne. I didn't realize. Sorry. Very, very much. You've given us a lot to think about, especially those closing remarks of yours are quite sobering and a little frightening. And I wonder the extent to which they will help us or at least help us from making a decision on who we're going to vote for. I wasn't quick enough to be able to hear what you were saying in relation to what Paul was saying. So Paul, if you could come in for a sec quickly and tell us how closely the two of you are aligned in your thinking and your scenarios rather than your predictions. Paul?
Sure, thanks. And thanks, Wayne. I think I'm not going to add too much to what Wayne said in terms of the likelihood and probability of Party A finding common cause with Party B. I think Wayne's covered it very nicely, and Wayne and Ibrahim have got much more of a bird's eye view and a rapport with the party personalities. I like to work in the back office with cats, and you know, and I'm working on being more sociable, but Wayne and Ibrahim have a downbeat. I would just like to add two very quick points. That I agree with Wayne, there's a risk of great instability through these coalitions. The last 5 years, we haven't had great examples of working coalitions. So the first point, Leslie, is that there is an increased responsibility that we as the public are charged with to make sure these coalitions work as much as we can. However we can bring pressure to bear on the parties to work in the best interests of the municipalities and communities, however we can make credible the threat of punishing them for collapsing the municipalities. The second point, and I'm sure Wayne and Ibrahim can speak more on this, what we are seeing, what we saw with the Phoenix posters, is that particularly in the big parties, and this speaks to Wayne's point about a top-down national directive and autocratic leadership where the command comes from on high and it's filtered down to the regions. I'm not sure if that's going to work everywhere. If it was working in the DA, we wouldn't have had the KZN DA put up those posters with knowing that they would sabotage their counterparts in Gauteng if they weren't adhering to that old cliche of all politics being local. And we know that on a disaggregated level, there are pockets and groupings, regional control in the big parties that don't see eye to eye with the national picture. And that will further complicate the possible coalition scenario. We may have more of what we've seen, which Wayne can speak about, that in some areas COPE works with DA and in some areas with the ANC. And I think that that's something we could see more of going forward.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Thank you very much. I see Ibrahim has joined us, so I'm going to move over to him. And in my mind, this conversation is flowing very nicely right into Ibrahim's focus, which is on whether local government elections, in fact, leading straight off your point there, Paul, is whether local government elections are the panacea for many of the challenges that are facing us, or whether they actually deepen the malaise, as Ibrahim has spoken. So Ibrahim, thanks for moving from the SABC to the Bazoom Club. I believe you've moved up, I would like to think. So over to you, thank you.
Hi, thanks very much, Leslie, and thanks for everyone at the Bazoom Club. I was going to start off with a bad joke saying two Jews and a Muslim walk into a Zoom, and the Muslim doesn't differ with either of them. And that is true in this case. So Wayne was talking about whether I would split hairs about minority governments versus coalitions. Actually, we agree. I was splitting hairs with someone else on the SABC about this question of coalitions and versus minority governments, and I still hold the view that they are minority governments, as Wayne does. So they are minority governments. That's what we've had experience of. We've got experience of coalitions elsewhere, and they work reasonably well in some parts of the country, and that's because they have some kind of principal agreement, even if it's not always reduced down to a document or a set of principles. But there's a broad conceptual agreement about what they want to do in certain places and to keep momentum for stability and so on in some of the municipalities where there's arrangements. And what we've had so far are loose arrangements, even in terms of the formal coalitions that we've had in some of the municipalities. But my focus is going to be, as Leslie suggests, on a question of whether this election will be a panacea or whether it will deepen the paralysis. And my view is that, unfortunately, on the 2019 election, And when Cyril Ramaphosa was elected president of the ANC in 2017, my question then was, is it going to be paranoia or is it going to be paralysis? And unfortunately, it is both paranoia and paralysis. And I'm going to stick to a similar kind of conceptual frame now and suggest that, you know, there's going to be, the elections are going to be a panacea in some places, or the beginnings of a panacea in some places. And unfortunately, in many others, it's going to be a question of deepening the malaise. And there are several reasons why this is the case. So I need to go into a little bit of context. Contextually, we are entering this election in unprecedented circumstances. We all know about COVID, the inability to campaign, the inability for outreach, the spurious, in my view, relaxation of the lockdown regulations and all of that. But nevertheless, the parties didn't waste a moment. They carried on campaigning as they could, as much as they could. What was absent was the big rallies and the major outreach activities that parties conducted. But nevertheless, there were still vigorous campaigns. And it's interesting that in some places, even President Ramaphosa, no matter how popular he is, was met with a little bit of resistance. And in some cases, even outright rejection, as in Soweto. So it's interesting that that dynamic is occurring, even though compared to the party, ANC's president is way more popular than the ANC as a party, which is why he's the central cog in this election campaign, right? Secondly, you also get the sense that this election campaign is not, in fact, about the local issues. It's not about the municipal issues. It's all about a whole range of other national, high-profile, emotive stuff that makes people susceptible to follow their party thinking rather than rational, critical thinking about what local issues face them. So the issues are all about national issues, and that works for the ANC because, I mean, what do they campaign on locally? They can't. Every successful municipality that they will want to hold up is not an ANC-run municipality. So it was impossible to campaign in that way, and therefore Ramaphosa remains the cog in the central campaign platform. Contrast that with the way in which the DA is received and is covered in the media. And it is blanketly uncritical. I mean, Leslie knows me for a long time and knows that that is not my kind of politics. Wayne and Paul know me similarly well, Paul for much longer, and know that that's not my kind of politics. But one has to be honest, because we're looking at this as objective observers. And unfortunately, the DA, for all of its inconsistency, its incoherence, and often even its own hypocrisy, I would hate to say they don't get fair coverage in the media. It's almost as if the public love to hate them, and the media especially so. So the ANC will be criticized, the ANC will be lampooned, the ANC will be ridiculed, all of those things happen. But when there's a mundane message that the ANC puts out around service delivery, about a district development model, about launching a new local government barometer, some M&E system which is going to track how councillors behave, it gets great coverage in the media. The DA, even their mundane messages, don't get any coverage whatsoever. The only coverage they get is negative. And the EFF, for that, I mean, as far as the EFF goes, I am gobsmacked at the level of infantile and completely immature fascination with what this party is. And there is completely uncritical coverage. There is completely uncritical, even amongst commentators and analysts, there's a completely uncritical take on what and who this party is and what they're about. And that has set up the context for this election. So in terms of the party dynamics, that's where we are. Institutionally, we go into this period in completely difficult and dangerous terrain. There is a major crisis of credibility across institutions and political parties as organizations. I don't often trust public opinion surveys. Paul knows this, and when we've worked together, we have worked only on the basis of actual election data which has come out. But there are two surveys which I do trust. The one is from the Human Sciences Research Council South African Attitude Survey, and the second is the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation's Afrobarometer and Transformation Audit. Now, when you look at those two surveys, there are two very worrying trends. A, political parties enjoy extremely low levels of trust and confidence among the population, less than a quarter, less than 25%. The ANC edges slightly above that at 27%. As for all other political parties, opposition included, 24%. Local councils, local government is down at 23%. That means there's completely wholesale no trust in local councils, which is what we're going to elect right now. Third worrying feature is that the IEC, the election manager, goes into this election on the back foot. Historically, the IEC has enjoyed the credibility and trust of at least 2/3 of South Africans. In the latest rating survey, less than a third, or just about a third. That's a cataclysmic drop. And part of this is, of course, the consequence of negative messaging from political party leaders and so on. Thankfully, it appears over the last week or 2 weeks, the credibility of the IEC has come up a little bit, but the credibility of other institutions persists as badly. For our media colleagues, there's some good news that the public does trust the media, both the public broadcaster and the private media, and they do so slightly more than they do even the courts. So the media is in good standing, but that doesn't mean you should squander the credibility that you have by being stenographers of one or other party. But the fourth, and this is a really worrying thing, which is a crisis of representation and a crisis of democracy generally. The survey reveals that more than 2/3 of South Africans are prepared to forgo elections and are prepared to forgo democratic government if a government will promise and deliver to them health, education, on crime and jobs. So if governments are prepared to give them those four things, they're prepared to forgo democratic government, and they've prepared to forgo even elections. So that's an incredibly worrying finding, which is now consistent with findings across the African continent. And I say this for two reasons. A is that it is providing an early indicator that the crisis of credibility in institutions is actually lurching towards a democratic representation crisis. And that's a problem for the exercise of public authority. That's number one. Number two, the reason why I talk about this as reflective of trends across the African continent is that because of what Paul and Wayne are talking about and the construction of the different scenarios and how parties make calculations about who they want to work with, is that the parties have absolutely no fidelity to a set of principles. So there's no core ideology. Everything is negotiable. They don't even have a higher level or higher order set of conceptual principles that they lay fidelity to and that they are prepared to negotiate around, which means that you then end up with a situation as you do in countries like Lesotho or Kenya, where from election to election, the nature of the coalitions change and they shift and they chop and they change. So today, Wayne and I can be friends and we are enemies with Paul. And then next week, Paul and I are big mates and we big mates, and then we both fight with Wayne. And that kind of thing is perpetuating itself in the nature of politics in Lesotho and in Kenya, which is why you've had so many waves of instability. And that's why the scenarios that Wayne and Paul are pointing out, I'm not going to say anything about the accuracy of them, but I am going to say that the way in which they are playing out is incredibly worrying because it reinforces this data that I just cited about the credibility crisis. And what no one points out is that the prolonged credibility crisis starts to lurch towards a legitimation crisis. And that for me is incredibly worrying as a citizen and as a publicly spirited and public-minded person as the rest of us in this group are. Now, I don't know if there's any other practical, real questions about the political dynamics that we want to talk about, or perhaps I'll leave that for questions. But the main thing I wanted to point out, Leslie, in this input was about this crisis of institutions and the crisis of credibility, the crisis of credibility in political parties, and that it is lurching towards a major legitimation crisis for democracy and for democratic government. And it hollows out our institutions, and it doesn't bode well for any which way in which the election plays out, and who wins in which place, and in which kind of coalitions or minority governments are cobbled. We have an incredibly worrying sort of picture of institutional decay and institutional debasement. And I summarize this as saying that what we're facing is a context of politicized uncertainty, this is a paper that I've been working on. So it's a crisis of politicized uncertainty that we're facing, and economically, it's economic informality, greater amount of informality. The processes of democratic and public decision making, of oversight, of responsiveness are breaking down, and institutionally you're faced with institutionalized ambiguity. So the theme that we're looking, or the outlook we're looking at, is both politicized uncertainty, institutionalized ambiguity, and economic informality. In the nature of the politics that we're facing in the future is that I think we're moving from a mode of contestation and competition to outright confrontation and conflict. And that is going to be germane to the kind of scenarios that Paul and Wayne have been pointing out. And perhaps I'm going to park it there, and we'll take questions, the three of us, in discussion after this. So thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me again.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Ibrahim. That was a full range of thought-provoking issues that you've raised, and very, very powerfully put forward to us. Just two small issues that I picked up on. I'm actually in Zanin area right now. And when I traveled from Johannesburg through Modimolle, Polokwane, and here in Zanin, and leaving Joburg, all the election posters are the same. There is not a change in message, and they all have party political leaders in them with the same messages. So you are absolutely spot on. There's nothing about the particularity of an area. And then my husband was always interested in the idea of whether you could use democracy to vote out democracy in the 4 issues that people are willing to give up democracy for. Okay, having said that, we have a few minutes left, and it was a really great experience to listen to. Are there any questions from the floor? Is there anybody who wants to speak to our 3 experts? Either just start speaking or put your question in the chat room. Anybody, anything to say? Anybody want to raise an issue? Okay, I can well understand why there is silence, because we've really been presented with a lot of facts, figures, and issues raised, and I know it's a lot. We are all thinking, meditating over what has been said, and don't want to raise any questions. I don't want to stop anybody from talking, but I don't want to force anybody to raise a question. Are we all good then? Again, thank you very much to the 3 people. And I've always wanted to do this. And since the 3 experts get to do it every day, I've always wanted my opportunity. So I'm going to sign out by saying, Leslie Hudson, Bazoom Club, Zanin, South Africa. Thanks for joining us tonight, and see you again at our next Bazoom Club. Thank you, Ibrahim. Thank you, Wayne.
Thank you.
So
Good luck to all on Monday.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good luck.
Good night, and thank you.
Good night. Good night. Thank you.